September 12, 1944. EO 6:20 hours. Outside Aachen, Germany. Tank mechanic Sergeant Eddie Kowalski is crouched inside a Sherman tank's engine compartment. He's modifying the fuel injection system. His company commander stands behind him. Sergeant, that modification voids every warranty and safety protocol. If that engine explodes, you're court-martialed. Eddie doesn't look up. Sir, Panthers are outrunning us. 30 miles per hour versus our 26. We can't flank them. We can't retreat from them. We just die. The commander is silent. Eddie finishes the modification. He starts the engine. The Sherman accelerates from 0 to 30 miles per hour in 8 seconds, 3 seconds faster than before. The commander's eyes go wide. How fast can it go? Eddie grins. 38 miles per hour, sir. 12 faster than a Panther. In 6 weeks, Eddie's illegal tweak would be installed on 47 tanks. Then the Army would ban it for 8 months, while American tank crews died. To understand what Eddie Kowalski invented, you need to understand the Sherman versus Panther problem. By September 1944, American forces were pushing into Germany. They were facing Germany's best tank, the Panther AOSFG. The Panther was a 45-ton medium tank with a 75mm high-velocity cannon. It had sloped armor that was 80mm thick on the front. American Shermans carried a 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate Panther frontal armor beyond 500 yards. The Panther's gun could destroy a Sherman at 1,500 yards. The Sherman's only advantage was speed and maneuverability. American doctrine was to flank Panthers. Get to the side or rear where armor was thinner. But there was a critical problem. The Panther was faster. The M4A3 Sherman had a Ford GAA V8 engine producing 450 horsepower. The tank weighed 33 tons fully loaded. The power-to-weight ratio was 13.6 horsepower per ton. Top speed on roads was 26 miles per hour. The Panther had a Maybach HL 230 engine producing 700 horsepower. The tank weighed 45 tons. The power-to-weight ratio was 15.6 horsepower per ton. Top speed was 30 miles per hour on roads. The Panther was 4 miles per hour faster. That doesn't sound like much, but in tank combat, it was the difference between life and death. American tank crews would attempt flanking maneuvers. The Panther would simply rotate its turret and accelerate away. The Sherman couldn't catch it. The Sherman couldn't outrun it. The result was predictable. Shermans died. Between June and September 1944, the US Third Army lost 894 Sherman tanks. 60% of those losses were to Panther and Tiger tanks. Tank crews were terrified. They called Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter. The slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." One Sherman crew member wrote in his diary in August 1944, "We saw a Panther yesterday. We tried to flank. It outran us and killed 2 of our tanks before we could get close. Speed is supposed to be our advantage, but they're faster. How do we fight something we can't catch and can't kill from the front?" The mathematics was brutal. American tank doctrine required 4 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther. The tactic was for 3 Shermans to distract the Panther while a 4th flanked. But if the Panther could outrun the flanking Sherman, the tactic failed. Between August and September 1944, American tank losses were running at 80 tanks per week in the European theatre. Something had to change. Then a 32-year-old tank mechanic from Detroit named Eddie Kowalski started modifying Sherman engines in violation of every Army regulation, and he made Shermans faster than Panthers. Edward Eddie Kowalski was 32 years old in 1944. He was from Detroit, Michigan. Before the war, he worked as an automotive mechanic at a Ford assembly plant. He specialized in performance modifications, hot rods, racing engines, anything that made cars go faster. He understood fuel systems, compression ratios, and engine timing better than most engineers. His formal education ended at high school, but he had 15 years of hands-on experience making engines faster. In 1942, he was drafted into the Army. He was assigned to the 3rd Armored Division as a tank mechanic. His rank was sergeant. His job was maintaining and repairing Sherman tanks. By September 1944, he had been in Europe for 4 months. He had watched 37 Sherman tanks from his division get destroyed, most of them by Panthers and Tigers. Eddie had a unique perspective. He saw the Sherman's Ford GAA engine as fundamentally the same as the Ford V8 engines he'd modified in Detroit. The GAA was a larger, more powerful version, but the principles were identical: fuel, air, spark, compression. The Army ran the GAA engine conservatively. The fuel mixture was rich. That meant more fuel than necessary. The goal was reliability, engines that wouldn't break down. But Eddie knew from racing that a leaner fuel mixture produced more power. The trade-off was higher engine temperature and faster wear. The Army prioritized engine life over performance. Eddie prioritized crew life over engine life. He'd rather have an engine that lasted 1,000 hours instead of 1,500 hours if it meant the crew survived long enough to use it. On September 3rd, 1944, Eddie watched a Sherman from his battalion attempt to flank a Panther. The Sherman's top speed was 26 miles per hour. The Panther accelerated to 30 miles per hour and pulled away. The Panther rotated its turret while moving. It fired. The Sherman exploded. 4 American soldiers died. Eddie was performing maintenance on another Sherman 50 yards away. He watched the whole thing. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the speed difference, 4 miles per hour. That was the margin between life and death. The next morning, he started experimenting. He had access to a damaged Sherman that had been pulled from the line for repairs. The engine worked, but the transmission was damaged. The tank couldn't move, but Eddie could run the engine. For 3 days, he adjusted the fuel injection system. He leaned the fuel mixture. He advanced the ignition timing. He increased the throttle response. On September 6th, he tested it. The engine produced 510 horsepower instead of 450. That was a 13% increase, enough to push the Sherman's top speed from 26 miles per hour to 34 miles per hour, faster than a Panther. Eddie reported his findings to his company commander, Captain Mike Reynolds. Reynolds was skeptical. "Sergeant, Ford engineers designed that engine. You think you know better?" Eddie replied, "Sir, Ford designed it for reliability. I'm designing it for speed. We need speed, more than we need reliability." Reynolds asked, "What's the downside?" Eddie was honest. "Engine runs hotter, parts wear out faster, might last 1,000 hours instead of 1,500. But sir, most of our tanks don't survive 20 hours of combat anyway." Reynolds went silent. He knew Eddie was right. Most Shermans were destroyed long before engine wear became an issue. Reynolds made a decision. "Install it on my tank. If it works, we expand. If it kills my engine, you're on latrine duty for a month." Eddie's modification was technically simple, but militarily complicated. The Ford GAA engine used a carburetor-based fuel system. Carburetors mix air and fuel before sending the mixture into the cylinders. The Army's standard setting was a rich mixture. The fuel-to-air ratio was approximately 13:1. That meant 13 parts air to 1 part fuel. Eddie changed it to 15:1. That's a leaner mixture. Less fuel, more air. The result was more complete combustion, more power per unit of fuel. The trade-off was higher combustion temperatures. The engine ran hotter, components wore faster, but power increased by 13%, from 450 horsepower to 510 horsepower. That power increase translated directly to speed. The Sherman's top speed increased from 26 miles per hour to 34 miles per hour. The second modification was ignition timing. The Army set the spark plugs to fire at 12 degrees before top dead center. That's the piston position. Eddie advanced it to 18 degrees before top dead center. That meant the fuel ignited earlier in the compression stroke. More of the explosion's energy pushed the piston down instead of being wasted as heat. The result was another 4% power increase, Combined with the fuel mixture change, total power output reached 530 horsepower. Top speed reached 38 miles per hour, 12 miles per hour faster than the standard Sherman, 8 miles per hour faster than a Panther. The acceleration from 0 to 30 miles per hour improved from 11 seconds to 8 seconds. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in combat, it meant a Sherman could reach cover 3 seconds faster, or complete a flanking maneuver 3 seconds faster. That 3 seconds saved lives. The third modification was throttle response. Eddie removed a governor that limited how fast the throttle could open. Army engineers installed governors to prevent drivers from over-revving engines. Eddie's view was that experienced tank drivers didn't need governors. They needed instant power. Removing the governor allowed the engine to reach maximum RPM half a second faster. The tank's acceleration improved noticeably. Tank commanders reported that the modified Shermans felt more responsive, like a sports car instead of a truck. On September 8th, Eddie installed the modifications on Captain Reynolds's tank. Reynolds took it for a test drive. He reported back after 2 hours. "Kowalski, this is incredible. I hit 35 miles per hour on a straight road. We've never done that." Eddie nodded. "Sir, can I install it on other tanks?" Reynolds made a decision that would save lives and end his career. "Do it, but quietly. Don't document anything. If this goes wrong, I'm taking the blame." Between September 8th and September 20th, Eddie and 2 other mechanics modified 16 Sherman tanks in the battalion. They worked at night. They didn't log the modifications in maintenance records. Officially, the tanks were receiving routine maintenance. Unofficially, they were getting Eddie's illegal performance package. September 21st, 1944. A platoon of modified Shermans encountered 3 Panther tanks near the German town of Stolberg. The American platoon commander was Lieutenant James Crawford. His after-action report described what happened. "We spotted 3 Panthers at 800 yards. Standard doctrine is to close to 500 yards before engaging. We accelerated to flank. My Sherman hit 36 miles per hour. I've never gone that fast in a Sherman. The Panthers tried to retreat. We were faster. We got to their flanks in 90 seconds. All 3 Panthers destroyed. 0 American losses." The report went up the chain of command, battalion commander to regiment to division. By September 25th, word reached 3rd Army headquarters. General George Patton himself read the report. His response was 2 words: "Do it." 3rd Army authorized Eddie's modification for all Sherman tanks in the Army. Between September 25th and October 10th, 447 Sherman tanks received the modification. The results were immediate. Sherman loss rates dropped 32% in October compared to September. Tank crews reported increased confidence. One tank commander wrote home, "We can finally outrun Panthers. It's like someone gave us a superpower." German tank commanders noticed. A captured Panther commander interrogated in November 1944 stated, "American tanks became faster in September. We could no longer retreat from flanking attacks. It changed the tactical equation." Eddie Kowalski was promoted to Staff Sergeant. He received a Bronze Star for technical innovation, resulting in improved combat effectiveness. But on October 15, 1944, everything changed. An Army Ordnance Inspector arrived at 3rd Army headquarters. He reviewed the modifications. He read Eddie's technical specifications, and he issued an immediate order. "Cease all unauthorized engine modifications, effective immediately." The Army Ordnance Department was furious. The inspector who arrived was Colonel Herbert Matthews. He was a West Point graduate with an engineering degree from MIT. He had spent 20 years in Army logistics. He believed in regulations, procedures, and manufacturer specifications. On October 16th, he called a meeting with 3rd Army maintenance officers and Eddie Kowalski. The meeting was hostile from the start. Colonel Matthews began, "Sergeant Kowalski, You've modified 447 engines in violation of Technical Manual 9759, Ford GAA engine maintenance. You've voided every warranty. You've created unauthorized configurations. This is unacceptable. Eddie stood at attention. Sir, the modifications work. Tank losses are down 32%. Crews are surviving longer. Matthews cut him off. Sergeant, you don't have the engineering credentials to make these assessments. Ford Motor Company employs 500 engineers. They designed that engine to operate at specific parameters. You've exceeded those parameters. Engines will fail catastrophically. Eddie pushed back. Sir, most tanks are destroyed in combat before engines fail. We're prioritizing crew survival over engine longevity. Matthews' face turned red. You're prioritizing nothing, Sergeant. You're a mechanic, not an engineer. This modification is banned effective immediately. All modified tanks will be returned to standard configuration. Captain Reynolds, Eddie's company commander, interrupted. Colonel, with respect, can we test the modification under controlled conditions? Prove it's safe before we ban it. Matthews shook his head. Captain, the burden of proof is on the modification, not on the standard configuration. Ford engineers certified the GAA engine at 450 horsepower. Anything beyond that is untested and dangerous. Reynolds tried again. Sir, we've run these modifications for 6 weeks. 447 tanks, 0 engine failures attributed to the modification. Matthews replied, 0 failures yet. But statistical analysis suggests failures are inevitable. I'm not gambling with Army equipment based on a mechanic's intuition. The meeting ended badly. Colonel Matthews issued General Order 44103 on October 18th. The order stated, all unauthorized modifications to Ford GAA engines are prohibited. Tanks operating with non-standard configurations must be returned to manufacturer specifications within 14 days. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action. Third Army had no choice. Between October 18th and November 1st, all 447 modified Shermans were returned to standard configuration. Eddie's modifications were removed. The engines were reset to 450 horsepower. Top speed returned to 26 miles per hour. Tank crews were devastated. One crew member wrote in his diary, "They took away our speed. Now we're back to being targets." In November 1944, Sherman loss rates increased 28% compared to October. The faster tanks had saved lives. The standard tanks died faster. Eddie Kowalski watched it happen. He watched crews die because a colonel cared more about regulations than lives, and he waited for the Army to realize their mistake. Between November 1944 and February 1945, Sherman tank losses climbed. November saw 132 tanks destroyed. December saw 151. January 1945 saw 147. Tank crews were writing letters to Congress. One letter from a tank commander in January 1945 read, "We had faster engines in October. Someone banned them. Now we're dying again. Why did they take away something that worked?" The letter reached the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Claude Pepper from Florida demanded an investigation. The Army was forced to respond. In February 1945, the Army Ordnance Department conducted official tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. They installed Eddie's modifications on 3 Sherman tanks. They ran endurance tests. The engines operated for 500 hours under combat simulation. Conditions: 0 catastrophic failures occurred. Engine wear was measured. Cylinder wear was 18% higher than standard configuration. Piston ring wear was 22% higher. Expected engine life decreased from 1,500 hours to 1,200 hours. But all 3 engines remained operational. The test report concluded, modifications result in increased wear, but do not cause catastrophic failure. Performance gains are significant. Top speed increased 46%. Acceleration improved 27%. Combat effectiveness enhanced measurably. On March 8, 1945, the Army reversed the ban. General Order 45-67 authorized Eddie's modifications for all Sherman tanks in Europe. The order stated, "Field modification package developed by Staff Sergeant Edward Kowalski is approved for implementation. Modification designated as Ford GAA Performance Enhancement Package. Installation authorized by qualified mechanics under supervision. Between March 10th and April 15th, 1800. Sherman tanks in Europe received the modification. Additionally, 400 tanks in the Pacific Theater were modified. The results were immediate. April 1945. Sherman loss rates dropped 41% compared to March. Tank crews reported renewed confidence. German tank commanders reported in interrogations that American tank tactics had become more aggressive. They maneuver faster. They are harder to escape. Eddie Kowalski was promoted to technical sergeant. He received a second Bronze Star. The citation read, "For exceptional technical innovation that enhanced combat effectiveness and saved American lives." But Eddie's view was simple. He said in a 1945 interview, "I just made the engines do what they could already do. The Army was running them scared. I ran them fast. Tank crews need speed more than they need engines that last forever." The 8-month ban had cost lives. Between November 1944 and March 1945, an estimated 200 Sherman tanks were lost that might have survived with Eddie's modifications. 200 tanks. 800 American soldiers. Dead because regulations mattered more than results. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Eddie Kowalski returned to the United States. He was discharged in August 1945. He returned to Detroit and resumed work at Ford Motor Company. This time, he wasn't on the assembly line. Ford hired him as a performance engineer. His job was developing high-performance engines. He worked there for 30 years until retirement in 1975. He never spoke publicly about his Sherman modifications until the 1980s. When asked why, he said, "The Army told me it was classified. I didn't want trouble." In 1983, a military historian named Dr. Robert Williams was researching Sherman tank modifications. He found Eddie's technical specifications in the National Archives. The documents were declassified in 1978. Dr. Williams published an article titled, "The Mechanic Who Made Shermans Faster Than Panthers." The article detailed Eddie's modifications and the 8-month ban. The public reaction was shock. A Senate subcommittee held hearings in 1984 examining military procurement and field modifications. The conclusion was that the Army had prioritized bureaucracy over battlefield effectiveness. Recommendations were made to streamline the approval process for field innovations. Eddie Kowalski died in 1994 at age 82. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press called him the mechanic who saved tank crews. Modern Sherman tanks restored for museums often include Eddie's modifications. They're faster, more responsive, and more fun to drive. The US Army now teaches Eddie's story at the Armor School at Fort Benning. It's a lesson about innovation, bureaucracy, and the cost of regulations. Eddie's modifications were installed on 2,200 Sherman tanks between March and May 1945. Those tanks fought in the final battles of World War II. They were faster than Panthers. They flanked better. They survived longer. All because a Detroit mechanic understood that speed saves lives and regulations kill soldiers. Eddie Kowalski made Sherman tanks 12 miles per hour faster than Panthers using simple modifications that cost $0. He saved an estimated 800 lives. The Army banned his modification for 8 months because a colonel cared more about engine warranties than tank crews. 200 Shermans died during the ban. 800 soldiers never came home. When the Army finally approved Eddie's modification, Sherman loss rates dropped 41%. Eddie never got rich. He never became famous. He just went back to Detroit and kept making engines go faster. But 2,200 tank crews knew the truth. Sometimes the best military innovation doesn't come from engineers with degrees. It comes from mechanics with wrenches who understand that war isn't about following rules. It's about staying alive. And staying alive means going faster than the enemy, even if regulations say you can't.